e4, king's pawn opening, opening line. The king's pawn opening move is both popular and logical. It controls the center, opens lines for both the queen and the bishop, and usually leads to an open game in which tactics, rather than slow maneuvering, predominates. c6, Caro-Kann defense, opening line. The Caro-Kann defense may be compared to the Slav defense against the queen's pawn. It strives for defense of the strong point at d5 and development of the queen's bishop. d4, Caro-Kann defense, opening line. 1 e4 c6, 2 d4 is the start of the Caro-Kann defense, a defense of long-standing merit. Black quietly stakes out a share of the center via support for the d5 pawn, and will use the half-open c-file after the exchange on d5 for his counterplay. If black avoids the exchange on d5, black will then play c5 later, undermining white's center. d5, Caro-Kann defense, opening line. Knight c3, Caro-Kann defense, traditional, opening line. d takes e4, Caro-Kann defense, traditional, opening line. Knight takes e4, Caro-Kann defense, traditional, opening line. Bishop f5, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. With the development of the queen's bishop at f5 or g4, black solves his positional problems. Knight g3, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. Bishop g6, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. h4, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. h6, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. Knight f3, Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, opening line. e6, out of opening book, Knight d7 would have been in the Caro-Kann defense, Capablanca variation, main line, Spassky variation, opening line. Bishop d3 enables the short castle. Bishop takes d3 prevents the opponent's kingside castle. Queen takes d3 clears the way for a kingside castle. White wins a bishop for a bishop. Material is even. Knight f6. Bishop f4 makes way for a castle to the queenside. Queen a5 check checks white's king. c3 removes the threat on white's king. Bishop e7 makes way for a castle to the kingside. Knight f1. c5. Knight 1 d2 frees white's pawn at c3 from the pin and enables the short castle. Queen a6 attacks white's queen. Knight c4 protects white's queen and blocks black's pawn at c5. Castle kingside. g4. Knight d5 threatens white's bishop and blocks white's pawn at d4. Bishop e5 moves it to safety and blocks black's pawn at e6. Knight c6. g5. h5. g6. Slightly better is d takes c5. Thinking. The chessmaster recommends pawn takes pawn. Your pawn captures pawn. Black counters with bishop takes pawn at c5. You move your bishop to g3. Black counters with the rook at a8 to d8. You move your queen to e2, which frees your knight at c4 from the pin. Black responds by moving rook at f8 to e8. You move your king to f1. Black counters by moving the pawn to b5, which threatens your knight at c4. You move your knight at c4 to d2, which moves it to safety and pins black's pawn at b5. Black answers with queen to a4, which frees the pin on black's pawn at b5. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn for a pawn. Additionally, the development of black's pawns is somewhat weakened. g6. Slightly better is d takes c5. c takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Queen takes d4. Frees the pin on white's knight. White wins a knight and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Material is even. Rook a c8. Knight e3. Bishop c5. Threatens white's queen. Queen e4. Moves it to safety and removes the threat on white's pawn at g6. Bishop takes e3. Hampers the opponent's ability to castle to the queen side. F takes e3. Clears the way for a queenside castle. F takes g6. Isolates white's pawn at h4. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop. Bishop d4. Slightly better is queen takes g6. Diagnosing. The chessmaster recommends queen captures pawn. Your queen takes pawn, which threatens mate. Queen captures pawn at g7, attacks black's pawn at h5, and blocks black's pawn at g7. Black responds by moving rook to f7. You move your bishop to d4, which removes the threat on your pawn at e3. Black counters by moving the rook at c8 to f8. You castle. Black counters with queen captures pawn. Your queen takes pawn at e6, which pins black's rook at f7, partially pins black's knight, and creates a passed pawn on e3. Black answers with queen to a1, which releases the pin on black's knight and checks your king. You move your king to c2, which moves it out of check and forks black's knight and black's queen. Black responds by moving queen to a4, which moves it to safety, protects black's knight, and checks your king. You move your king to c1, which moves it out of check and threatens black's knight. Black responds with the knight to c7, which moves it to safety and threatens your queen. You move your queen to g6, which moves it to safety, threatens black's pawn at h5, and blocks black's pawn at g7. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. Additionally, your attack potential is increased. Also, the pressure on black's king is somewhat increased, and the pressure on your king is somewhat decreased. Bishop d4. Slightly better is queen takes g6. Rook f5. Removes the a3. Rook c f8. Castle queenside. King h7. Rook h g1. Knight f6. Threatens white's queen. Queen c2. Moves it to safety. Knight g4. e4. Threatens black's rook at f5. Rook f1. Moves it out of immediate danger and pins white's rook at d1 with a partial pin. c4. Slightly better is king b1. Evaluating. The chess master recommends king to b1. You move your king to b1. Black answers with rook takes rook at d1, which checks your king. Your rook takes rook, which protects your king. Black replies by moving pawn to e5, which threatens your bishop. You move your bishop to c5, which moves it to safety and threatens black's rook. Black counters by moving the rook to f1, which moves it out of immediate danger and pins your rook with a partial pin. You move your queen to c1. Black counters by moving the rook to f4, which attacks your pawn at e4. You move your rook to d6, which attacks black's queen. Black answers with queen to c4, which moves it to safety, threatens your bishop, and blocks your pawn at c3. Your bishop captures pawn, which isolates black's pawn at b7. Black counters with queen captures pawn at e4, which checks your king and creates a passed pawn on e5. You move your king to a1, which moves it out of check. As a result of this line of play, you win a rook and a pawn for a rook and a pawn. In addition, black's mobility is greatly decreased. Also, black's pawn structure is a little weaker. Lastly, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. c4. Slightly better is king b1. Rook 1 f3. e5. Pins black's pawn at g6. Rook c8. c5. Rook c f8. King b1. Rook f1. Partially pins white's rook at d1. King a2. Frees white's rook at d1 from the pin. Rook takes d1, threatens white's bishop. Rook takes d1, protects white's bishop. White wins. Rook d8. Rook d2. Queen c6, blocks white's pawn at c5. b4, slightly better is b3. Diagnosing. The chess master recommends pawn to b3. You move your pawn to b3. Black counters with the queen to h1, which attacks your pawn at h4. You move your pawn to c6, which threatens black's pawn at a7. Black counters with queen, captures pawn at c6, which takes the queen out of the corner of the board. Your bishop takes pawn, which threatens black's rook and isolates black's pawn at b7. Black counters with rook takes rook, which pins your queen with a partial pin and threatens your queen with a double attack. Your queen captures rook. Black answers with knight captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on e6. You move your queen to e2, which threatens black's knight. Black counters with the knight to f3, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy and attacks your pawn at h4. You move your bishop to f2, which removes the threat on your pawn at h4. Black replies by moving the queen to c3. You move your bishop to g3. As a result of this sequence of moves, black's mobility is lessened. Additionally, black's pawn formation is somewhat disrupted. b4, slightly better is b3. Rook d5, slightly better is queen d5, check. Cogitating. The chess master recommends queen to d5. You move your queen to d5, which checks white's king. White counters with the queen to b3, which protects white's king. Your knight captures pawn, which creates a passed pawn on e6. White counters with queen captures queen, which frees white's bishop from the pin, and quadruple forks your rook, your knight, your pawn at e6, and your pawn at b7. Your rook captures queen, which partially pins white's bishop and removes the threat on your pawn at b7, your pawn at e6, and your knight. White responds with rook to e2, which frees white's bishop from the pin. Your rook captures bishop, which attacks white's pawn at h4. White counters with rook captures knight, which attacks your pawn at e6 and blocks your pawn at e6. Your rook takes pawn at h4, which creates passed pawns on g7, g6, and h5. White responds with the king to b2. You move your rook to h2, which protects your pawn at e6 and checks white's king. White replies by moving the king to c3, which moves it out of check and threatens your pawn at e6. you move your rook to h3, which protects your pawn at e6 and checks white's king. White responds by moving king to d4, which moves it out of check and attacks your pawn at e6. As a result of this line of play, you win a queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns for a queen and a knight. Additionally, the mobility of white's pieces is decreased. Also, your pawn structure is somewhat stronger, and white's pawn development is not as strong. Finally, the pressure on white's king is somewhat increased, and the pressure on your king is eliminated. Rook d5. Slightly better is queen d5, check. Bishop c3. Knight e3. Threatens white's queen. Queen c1. Moves it to safety. Knight f5. Attacks white's pawn at h4. Queen e1. Protects white's pawn at h4. Rook takes d2, check. Checks white's king. Bishop takes d2. Slightly better is queen takes d2. Thinking. The chess master recommends queen captures rook. Your queen takes rook, which protects your king. Black answers with knight takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on g7, g6, and h5. You move your queen to d6. Black replies by moving pawn to g5, which advances the passed pawn. Your queen takes queen, which forks black's pawn at e6 and black's pawn at b7. Black counters with pawn takes queen, which protects black's pawn at e6. You move your pawn to a4. Black responds with knight to f5, which takes the knight away from the edge of the board. You move your pawn to b5, which attacks black's pawn at c6. Black answers with knight to e7, which protects black's pawn at c6. You move your king to b3. Black replies by moving the pawn to h4, which advances the passed pawn. Your pawn takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on c6 and c5. Black responds with knight takes pawn, which blocks your pawn at c5. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win a queen, a rook, and a pawn for a queen and 2 pawns. Additionally, black's attack potential is greatly decreased. Also, the development of your pawns is improved. Finally, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. Bishop takes d2. Slightly better is queen takes d2. Queen d5, check. Checks white's king. King b2. Moves it out of check. Queen d3. Slightly better is knight takes h4. Cogitating. The chess master recommends knight takes pawn. Your knight takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on g7, g6, and h5. White responds with bishop to c3. You move your knight to f3, which moves it to safety and threatens white's queen. White responds with the queen to e3, which moves it to safety. you move your pawn to g5, which advances the passed pawn. White replies by moving pawn to c6, which attacks your pawn at a7. Your queen captures pawn at c6. White answers with queen captures pawn at a7, which isolates your pawn at b7. You move your queen to e4. White responds by moving the king to c1. You move your pawn to g4, which advances the passed pawn. White responds with the queen to c5. As a result of this line of play, you win 2 pawns for a pawn. In addition, your mobility is slightly increased. Also, your pawn structure is somewhat stronger, and White's pawn structure is a little weaker. Finally, the pressure on White's king is slightly increased, and the pressure on your king is eliminated. Queen d3. Slightly better is knight takes h4. Bishop g5 blocks black's pawn at g6. Knight d4. Queen c3 attacks black's queen. Queen e2 check moves it to safety and forks White's pawn at e5 and White's king. King b1 moves it out of check and attacks black's knight. Queen takes e5 protects black's knight and creates a passed pawn on e6. Black wins a pawn. a4. a6. King b2. Queen e2 check frees black's knight from the pin and checks White's king. Queen d2 protects White's king. Queen e4. Queen c3. e5. Slightly better is knight f3. Analyzing. The chess master recommends knight to f3. You move your knight to f3. White responds by moving bishop to d8. Your knight takes pawn, which creates passed pawns on g7, g6, and h5. White replies by moving pawn to b5. Your pawn takes pawn, which isolates White's pawn at c5 and White's pawn at a4. White counters with pawn, captures pawn. You move your knight to f5, which takes the knight away from the edge of the board. White responds with pawn to c6. You move your queen to e2, which forks White's king and White's pawn at b5. White responds by moving king to c1, which moves it out of check and threatens your pawn at b7. Your queen takes pawn, which protects your pawn at b7 and isolates White's pawn at c6. White responds with pawn to c7, which adds a promote threat at c7 and creates a passed pawn on c7. You move your queen to f1, which checks White's king. White counters by moving the king to c2, which moves it out of check. You move your queen to g2, which checks White's king. White responds by moving queen to d2, which protects White's king and threatens your queen. As a result of this sequence of moves, you win 3 pawns for a pawn. Additionally, White's mobility is somewhat decreased. Also, your pawn structure is a little stronger. Finally, the pressure on your king is slightly decreased. e5. Slightly better is knight f3. Queen c4 pins black's knight. Queen g2 check frees the pin on black's knight and checks white's king. King b1 moves it out of check. Queen c6 threatens white's pawn at a4 and blocks white's pawn at c5. a5 moves it to safety. Knight b5 blocks white's pawn at b4. King c1. Queen h1 check checks white's king. King d2 moves it out of check. Knight d4. Queen d3 leads to knight f3 check. King c3 knight takes g5 h takes g5 h4 b5 a takes b5 king b2 queen g2 check. King b3 queen g4 queen takes b5 queen f3 check. King b4 h3 queen c4 which wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. Better is bishop e7 leading to queen g1 queen d3 knight c6 bishop g5 knight takes b4 queen d6 queen g2 check. King c3 knight d5 check. King b3 queen f3 check. King c2 queen c3 check. King b1 which loses a pawn. This was white's key miscue in the game. White did regain the lost ground, but later resigned. Queen g2 check leads to king c1 queen a2 bishop e3 queen a1 check. King d2 queen b2 check. King d1 queen takes b4 bishop takes d4 e takes d4 c6 queen a4 check. King e2 queen a2 check. King d1 which wins a bishop and a pawn for a knight. Better is knight f3 check leading to king c3 knight takes g5 h takes g5 h4 b5 a takes b5 king b2 queen g2 check. King b3 queen g4 queen takes b5 queen f3 check. King b4 h3 queen c4 which wins a bishop and a pawn for a knight and a pawn. Black's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but white ended up resigning anyway. King c3 leads to queen a2 queen d1 knight b5 check. King d3 queen d5 check. King c2 queen c4 check. King d2 queen takes b4 check. King e3 queen takes c5 check. King f3 knight d4 check. King e4 queen takes a5 queen d2 queen b5 bishop e3 queen c6 check. King d3 which loses 3 pawns. Better is king c1 leading to queen a2 bishop e3 queen a1 check. King d2 queen b2 check. King d1 queen takes b4 bishop takes d4 e takes d4 c6 queen a4 check. King e2 queen a2 check. King d1 which wins a knight for a bishop and a pawn. Queen a2 Queen D1. White resigns.